The first phone sales job I ever had was selling chimney cleanings, and that's really the pits of the telemarketing world because it's extremely predatory because they couldn't even operate in the same state where the business is. They sent chimney cleaners to Jersey every day because what they actually do is they have us call people and they say, well, chimney cleaning is $40 and you need to do it because let's say you have a gas chimney. If it gets blocked, you'll get a backdraft of carbon monoxide, and that'll kill all your children. How do you like that? And so, you say this to people on the phones, and they'll be like, well, sure, you can clean my chimney for $40. But when they get there, they'll sabotage the chimney. They'll break pieces off of it. Then
Of
they'll come
course.
out and say, well, look, I couldn't stick a pipe down there. I didn't want to break it more. Look at all these pieces. You guys need an entirely new liner in your chimney, or it might collapse.
Uh,
Okay, but look, we'll do you a favor. We'll do it for $1,000 flat. And so that was the scheme. And these people were so unruly. They would have their guys. They'd just be like, "Oh, look, just put your back against the wall and push with your legs. Just loosen up this old chimney," or things like that. Once, they accidentally set a family of raccoons on fire in the midst of one of their cleanings, and the raccoons tumbled through the fireplace into the living room, still in flames.
oh,
And
classic.
the people who worked in that place were amazing. I mean, there was a guy there who'd been in prison for like 3 years for holding his girlfriend hostage on the roof with a shotgun, and
Nice.
he he's a really interesting character. If I ran into him in 7-Eleven, I was like, "Oh, Rob, I didn't recognize you with the glasses." He's like, "That's the idea. I'm a ghost. I'm a ghost."
Oh
And
my God.
he would just he'd scream into the phone and curse at people. He would tell them, "Get it done, faggot." And then if they hung up on him, he would call them back and somehow miraculously book these jobs. There's another guy who would drink so much he'd just have a water bottle full of vodka, just straight vodka, so it would appear to be water, and he'd drink all night, and then eventually he would forget what he was supposed to be selling, and he'd be sitting there and talking about, well, who would you rather see in concert, Christina Aguilera or Britney Spears? Okay, I've noted that, and then go on to ask them more questions like that. But there's another guy, he'd been working there for like 20 years. His whole pitch was just chimney cleaning, half price for the next 2 weeks, 50% off. That was it. That was all he said. And then he would give them the threats when they asked him questions. And then, he was always ordering, medicine online because his whole body was covered in these open sores.
Oh yeah.
And, one day he came up to me, and, at the time I always wore a long black trench coat. So he said to me, hey, Keanu Reeves, what do you think would happen if I went outside the front door and, I just took a big fat dump right there? I'm like, well, gee, Rick, I don't know. You just have, you'd have to try and report back to me. A little while later, this other woman comes in, and she's a real like nutcase. She thinks Ronald Reagan is the second coming, and she makes comments like, "Oh well, I think we should take all the homosexuals and put them on the moon," and she she comes running in the front door screaming, "Some kind of animal just defecated outside the door." It's and that was
oh
that place. It was amazing. It was a complete cesspool.
yeah. I think people overlook the fact that most of the earth is like that, and probably most people are like that.
Yeah,
I mean, it takes me back. I worked in a call center in southwestern Virginia for like 2.5 years, and it's the same type of clientele. I mean, I could tell you about the obese albino with really bad stringy hair who smelled like a farm, and he would just leap up out of his chair and fart like past gas, the most disgusting thing you've ever seen in your life. Sit back down, enormously pleased with himself. There was like a 6'6" transsexual named Jasmine. I don't know if I ever told you about him, her, but imagine Abe Lincoln in lipstick, the ugliest would-be woman you've ever seen. Jerry curl, short hair, bone rail, thin, and had a voice like 2 octaves deeper than mine. But the thing was, Jasmine would answer the phone and start off with like a female voice, but fail to hold it. So it would be like, "Thank you for calling your network. My name is Jasmine. How can I help you?" Every fucking call. There was a dude who had to stop and lean like every 10 yards. So he would come to work like a half hour early, like real fat, but real tiny legs, like legs that are practically the size of a child. He'd make it through the doors. He'd have to stop in the hallway and lean for several minutes. Then he would go like another 10 yards. So he would make his way to his fucking desk by stages. Man, there was a midget in a wheelchair who looked just like Peter Lorre. Ashen white face, jet black hair, big black eyes, and you'd be in the break room eating food at a table, and he would wheel his chair up to the table and just sit there and stare at you and not say anything. And they fired that fucker for stealing food from the break room. He would just take people's lunches out of the fridge and just eat them.
Wow.
Oh, the list goes on, man. I mean, there was a guy, this pear-shaped asshole with a bald head, real tiny beady eyes. And for one reason or another, this asshole would walk to work from a town that was like 20 miles away. And the thing was that he wore black sneakers and no socks, and he smelled so terribly bad. Honest to God, you would smell the guy coming before you saw him. I kid you, the only time in my life where I've encountered that, you'd think it's impossible, but he smelled so bad, you know he was coming, then you would look around and there he is, down, on the horizon. And one girl practically vomited. She had to sit next to him the one day, and she almost threw up. The guy smelled so bad. And this ended up being one of the reasons why I got fired, because I complained to management about it. I sent a note to the manager, and I was like, well, don't you think somebody should intervene about this because it's a hygiene issue? And this asshole writes back, how do you know we haven't intervened? Rah, 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 rah. So this set the stage for me being fired because I dared the question. But obviously no one had intervened because the guy is causing people to vomit.
That's fantastic.
The cases were endless. I mean, you could go every person is like a freak, monstrosity. You can write down the list. No exceptions.
Well, I've really encountered no end of that. I mean, things are so consistently surreal that my associates and I have to sort of look at each other and say, "Is this actually real?" This isn't the reality we were led to expect. There's something paradoxical in the extreme. There's some strange force at work, just organizing everything in the most counter-aesthetic fashion possible. Because every person appears to be insane and some kind of dangerous degenerate.
Well, that's how it is. That's how they all are. It's amazing. These people exist in such vast numbers, and yet the civilization seems to have no idea they exist. But we don't even know what their numbers are. They could well be the majority. I've seen it. When I lived in Philly, it was the same thing, man. I lived in North Philly for a while in a warehouse. One of the stupidest things I ever did. I was in the front room of a warehouse. There was a friend of mine who was already living there. And, at night, these cockroaches would come out like the size of golf balls, skitter around. No fear whatsoever. Crawl right up into bed, under your pillow. The prostitutes would screw their johns right outside the window. I mean, this is old news to you because you live this sort of thing all the time. But, you go outside, there'd be like a dozen condoms in the curb. And you just walk up the street a few blocks and then enter the bad part of town, you know? Like there's a whole region where you've got the buildings on each side, but then the subway, whatever they want to call it, is on a bridge that practically blots out the sun because the metal rails, right, run at the height of these buildings between them, so the sunlight only comes in through the cracks for like many blocks. And I walked up there the one time, and you'll find people laying in the street, pregnant women wandering around barefoot in the street. you're, like, you're way the fuck out. Oh, this we had seen somehow that somebody had said that they were trying to open what they called the Alfred Jerry Theater, and its location was way up there in that part of town. Now these other assholes that were there, they were too scared to go up. I said, I'll go up and look. So I went up there and encountered all this stuff, found this building, if you want to call it that. It was, one of these places is like a meter wide, but 3 stories tall, one of these inner city type things. And these two gay dudes claiming that they're starting the Alfred Jerry Theater there in that place. And I'm sitting there talking to them like, oh God, what have I done? I've come up here and now, and they start explaining to me how what they do for fun is they take episodes of the Monkees. They've got the screenplays for them, the teleplays, and they recreate them, but as gay pornos, and they film them. The guy was telling me this as if like he was, number one, very proud of the fact, and number two, to see if I was going to be like titillated or aroused by the concept. Oh man, you know, there's no end to this shit. There's no end to it.
It all reminds me of home. I mean, because I grew up in a situation where, the goings on every day seemed so ludicrous that, a lot of times when I tell the stories, people, they don't believe it. I remember, it would be typical for my mother was so insane that she was more insane than, you know, what than what most people mean by the term. She would do things like, somehow get a hold of $100 and say, "Listen to me, uh, Whoppers are on sale for 99 cents. I need you to walk to Burger King, and I need 100 of them today." And I'm not sure that's a responsible allocation of our funds. And she's like, "Well, if you don't want to do that, I could just call the police and say that you threatened me with a knife, you know." And so then, maybe an hour and a half later, I've made my way to Burger King, and they're treating me like I'm some prankster kid. That like this is some kind of joke. I'm like, no, I'm completely serious. I'm here for 100 Whoppers. When I get back, and every day is just some kind of lunacy. It became a regular thing. Oh, I want $70 worth of soft shell tacos, or or so on, and or just go to the store and buy their entire supply of Snickers. Whatever box is there, just tell them you want the whole thing, including the box. And and that's hardly anything. I mean, this lady was so insane. I remember walking in once from high school, and she was masturbating in the living room, but she was using a hot dog, and she
Oh,
she was watching the Teletubbies.
oh, oh.
You know, it's now one of my personal hang-ups that I don't actually eat hot dogs. Because what she would then do is replace them back in this pot of
Oh
in the
no.
refrigerator, and
Oh,
then proceed to tell the guidance counselor at school, "Well, I'm concerned about my son. He won't eat my cooking. He
oh.
must be anorexic." And so then comes the official intervention. "Why don't you want to eat, dear boy?" Um, and then, you can't conceivably explain why you don't want to eat the food that's in the refrigerator.
Oh.
If it's all been used as an object of sexual self-stimulation.
Oh. Oh my God. How
I
did you
threw a
make it
party
through?
once. I threw this party, and she, she ambled out of the back room and began to give everyone sexual advice and to suggest that the party should become an orgy of some kind. She walked up to this hapless 14-year-old girl and her boyfriend, and she said to them, "Well, man, this is what you should do. You gotta stick it in until she squeals, man." And then proceeded to thrust her hips in front of their faces, and then went on to describe how semen could be used as a form of hairstyling gel.
Oh my God.
So, the real depths of what human beings can become and do, and which regularly happens, I mean, it's very apparent to me. At one point, she was bedding this man called Happy Bob, who was basically a functional retard. He was able to drive a car, and hold a job, but he must have had an IQ like Forrest Gump. Maybe it was 65 or 70, and most of his locutions uh, were were confined to saying things like "My name is Bob,"
Oh God.
but he'd walk around singing hymns about the greatness of God. Celebrate Jesus, celebrate, and things like that. But their relationship consisted of him repeatedly and systematically date raping my mother. He would come by with this cocktail of moonshine that he'd created in the garage in a
Oh.
glass jar with a tin foil over it, held down with a rubber band. And, she would drink it and pass out, and he would go to town. And I asked her, like, are you aware that this is a pattern? And she's like, "Yeah, man, but people got to do what they got to do."
Oh. Listen, it's a wonder that you turned out as well as you have, but I really would strongly recommend that before much more time passes, that you write all of this down. I've thought about it myself as well. And rather than write it in the form of a narrative, even like a memoir, you make it a statement of particulars. I think that's the most effective way to do it. You just concisely, you aim for concision and completeness. So it's like you're giving a list of facts in order about what you've experienced in your life, what has happened. You state this, you state this, you state this, every single event like one of these, and you just put them in order. You don't add commentary, you don't add a lot of dramatic staging, just make the complete list. And it's important because number one, it would end up having literary significance, literary value. But second, it's important to do it before a lot of time passes because you do forget. It's not
Sure.
that it's gone forever, but it just doesn't occur to you to access that particular memory while you still have youth on your side. You put them all down while it's fresh and vivid. Because
Oh, certainly true.
I don't even think I could do it at this point. It would be too much, it's too buried, too deep. It's not on the surface like it used to be even 10 years ago. So,
It all only comes back circumstantially. I'll be driving down the street because, lately I've been associating more with people who live in Long Island in the past year or two. And I'll say "Oh, well, this is the motel where I found my mother after she was missing for 3 days." And I hadn't thought about that in years. And how she was engaging in illicit sexual activity there with homeless people who she'd pulled in off the street. That was one of her hobbies, seducing the homeless. You know, but the point being that a lot of these things are things I only ever end up remembering circumstantially because they're anecdotally related to something else, or because we happen to pass the place where they occurred.
Yeah, that's perfectly normal. And the older you get, the more it has to be circumstantially triggered, which is what makes it difficult. If you wait till you're 40, 45, 50 to sit down and try to write these things, so much of it has become inaccessible. So, and if you want a cynical motive to do it, I'm sure if you wrote it in this way where everything is just a concise statement of fact, one after the other, you could probably make money off it, you know?
It's certainly conceivable. It's just, what often comes to mind is no one would really believe any of this because it's so ludicrous and it just goes on at such great length, with ever more like outrageous detail. But
Well,
there's nothing that can be done about that.
I'm sure, and whenever you write something, there's no telling what will happen. In many cases, nothing at all happens. But thanks to this being the internet age where everyone's trying to outdo each other all the time, trying to be, more crazy and come up with a more ridiculous, depraved meme. The thing is, a lot of what people come up with are just one-offs. And if people are trying to write extreme fiction today, they'll build a whole chapter around a single one-off crazy idea. But in what you're describing, since presumably it all really happened, the sheer fact that it would exist in such abundance and hang together and have its own kind of logic, that would, you know, argue against it being made up.
Sure. And I mean, there are mitigating factors that pretty much, I mean, because I've tried to reason why there are so many outrageous things, and it's just like, well, once you introduce one person who's willing to live on those terms, then it's going to create more and more situations that attract people who you know are operating in the same way.
No, that's true. That's true. I
And
mean,
so then,
all throughout my 20s, it was all my experience was this type of thing. And if you have a tolerance for it, then you tend to enter into, having another experience that's similar. You end up in places to live where this sort of thing happens much more often. Since I fled, I don't really have these experiences anymore, thank God. Life is much more boring and empty, but at the same time, I don't have that constant, relentless variety of ugliness and craziness. But
I wonder if it's a uniquely American phenomenon. I wonder whether, the mythos of individualism coupled together with the atomization of society where people are, socialized by the television and, they're indoctrinated into a form of obedience and minimal personal actualization and autonomy by the way the education and the work system happens. I wonder whether this society is uniquely uh, conducive to the emergence of this many non-functional degenerates.
I think it is, and the degenerates are much more original. You come over here, and what you find is, people always correspond to some pretty basic types, whether it's in a village or a city. You go into the city, even you find a ghetto, quote unquote, a ghetto. Even the people in the ghetto will basically break down into very obvious types. If you're talking about, black Africans from the deepest part of Africa who've come over, you'll have your drug dealer or your pimp or whatever, but it's all pretty transparently obvious. But the US, I think, for being such a great innovator, right? All it really innovates today is depravity. So it's a constant like melting pot. You've got all these original forms, these individually unique, crazed lunatics who just keep being spit out all the time.
Yeah, I mean, there's no shortage of them. I once lived with a man who called himself Lord Niripo, and he was probably the first person I met when I moved to Suffolk County. The church wanted to transplant us there so that I would have some more suburban opportunities and to grow up and be part of the ministry. And they drop us off at this place, this dilapidated house that smells from the cat urine you can smell for maybe half a block away. And I arrive, and there's a man standing in a hallway that's only lit by a red bulb. And he's got this long pointed cap like Santa Claus, except that it's not red. These dark glasses that look like they're made for the blind. And he says, "Greetings, son. My name is Lord Niripo." And sort of nod, because I'm just in fifth grade, and you just sort of don't question things that present themselves to you. But what I came to understand is that this guy had, he was on psychotropic medication, and he had lost his mind during the Vietnam War because he was dosed on significant amounts of LSD when he saw all of his friends' faces get blown up. And ever since then, his contact with reality was permanently severed. And so this guy was just off the charts. I mean, and yet, he became a source of a personal mentor to me, because before, his descent into psychosis, he'd been a poet and a member of literary circles. So he's like, well, look, we're going to read Herman Melville together, or I'm going to teach you how to chess, and moves in advance, how to use a rapier or an epee. And then he would descend back into madness and stare into space and start calling out to his lost pet monkey, which was apparently called Monkubot. And then, stand in the backyard calling out into the woods, "Monkubot, Monkubot, Monkubot." This is just the sort of thing that colored reality, parades of these characters, one after the other.
Well, that's quite good. We were friends with a guy at the tail end of my high school experience who had, when he was younger, the guy was like in his 60s, but he had been a hypnotherapist, and he was living with his equally senior citizen girlfriend. It was her apartment, her house that he was living in. And he seemed normal in every other respect, a little bit creepy. He had like a creepy smile he had all the time. But for two things. First off, he insisted on basically living in a cardboard box in the living room, in the center of the living room. That was number one. And number two, he would wear oven mitts all the time. So that was a good one. We had a guy in Philadelphia, Tommy McFarlane, who became a kind of mascot when I was there. And this guy wore these gigantic glasses, had no teeth, and he would go around. And of course, he had the ball cap, but he had these giant signs stapled to the ball cap. And it was the same old stuff. The Rockefellers had supercomputers that were controlling the earth and everything you can imagine. He had the shopping cart, of course, and would sleep on the street. We'd bring him to the warehouse sometimes. And in those days, I was much more dominated by madness, so I could get into the groove and have like, a colloquy with him, where we'd sit there and just like swap, and it would be this blended schizophrenic narrative where he would say something which was pure illusion, and I would be able to communicate with him by fitting into the narrative and saying something else which was pure illusion, and it would just go on and on and on. Oh my God.
What punctuated my situation and made it worse, well, let me continue setting the stage. In the same place where I lived with Lord Niripo, the lady who ran the house was 91 years old, but somehow still being allowed to act as a home health aide or nursing aide or something. And her whole place was in a complete state of disregard. I mean, she had all these cats that were allowed to freely urinate and defecate, and these vicious dogs which did the same. And they were Russian, and so her nephews would sometimes come for a couple months on work visas. And then they would drink relentlessly and beat the ever-living shit out of each other in the yard and break each other's ribs and give each other concussions. And then, for example, try to negotiate with the mailman to drive them down the block so they could buy more alcohol. And they would stand there trying to communicate, even though they didn't speak English, like making these gestures. and with limited English phrases, talking about how they'd like to bribe him to help them get more alcohol, and because it was only a block away, but they couldn't conceive making the journey, and the mailman would try to make I can't be here, and so on. And so in this insane environment, a woman who lived in the basement was a prostitute who copulated in full view of her 5-year-old son, and so on and so on. And in this environment, the whole alien thing is going on. I
Oh,
wake up at night and there's this entity standing there, when it's communicating information, about the nature of reality in its own quixotic, paradoxical way. And you know, it's in the midst of this completely dysfunctional, maladaptive human drama that this other level of reality is making itself apparent. And so, I mean, you could imagine it's like there is no reality to which to return. There's no baseline against which to judge uh, how to how to how to evaluate the rest of it.
you should just write all this down. And if you don't want to write it down, you should just take a digital audio recorder and speak into it as much as you can to get it as much down as you can, and then later transcribe it and make it a simple statement of facts.
It
I
would
mean,
certainly
nobody,
be entertaining.
well, nobody would believe it, but it'd probably be an excellent piece of writing. And I mean, I'm too weary for this shit anymore. I can't take it. Like my bucket is full, and it's never going to empty. I had enough. I had enough. 5 years ago when I fucking split that place. I'd never be able to take any more of it, really. And that's a
Yeah,
shame because when I was much crazier and naturally younger as well, I could write shit as a result of inhabiting that kind of craziness, but I just can't take it anymore.
well, I think some of your recent output has been, very admirable. I think the Crowley book had a lot of really stellar moments in it. I haven't met a person who isn't completely overawed by its final apotheosis and revelation in the closing pages. Because usually what I'll do is I'll show it to people who have some level of interest in this stuff. Either they study Crowley or they study, alternative counterculture metaphysics or something, and say, well, look, just turn to any page and read this, and then do it again and again, and they appreciate it. And then I'm like, well, look, now just read the ending, and they're completely overawed by it. They're taken aback.
Well, that's nice to hear. I wasn't even really aware that anybody had read it. I know you said you had skimmed it or you read it under the influence, and I thought that was probably the best reading I had gotten. Uh, I gave up on the idea of it even being read.
Well, yeah, no, I've shown it to a number of people, and their reactions have been appreciative, horrified, sometimes enraged, but also appreciative. I was doing a meditation counseling session with this guy who had, just found his dead father, and to sort of cheer him up, I was showing him passages from the book, and he was saying, well, this is so heinous and terrible, but it's so well written that I just, I don't know how to feel.
Oh, uh, well, I don't know. I don't know anything about it. I'm sure that Rimbaud, when he was on the slave ship doing whatever he was doing, he wasn't writing poetry anymore. And he reached a point where he wasn't doing the shit anymore. And I feel like I've pretty much reached that point. I'm talking about a tree falling in the woods and, not knowing if it made a sound. I've written all these things and nothing, you know. I wrote the Crowley book and I might sell one or two copies a month, but I never hear anything back about it. And what do I get? A couple of shitty, stupid reviews by one cunt who purchases the book but leaves a review before she could possibly have received the copy in order to say, well, yes, well, he has a lot of chutzpah, but he should really research the topic before he writes a book about it. What do you mean, research what fucking topic? Somebody who was some sort of self-styled Thelemite who wanted to defend the faith against detractors as quickly as she could in the comment section of the review section of a fucking Amazon page. So that's like the extent of my reading public for that book, so far as I've known. And the Crowley book wasn't even my best writing. I mean, it was, I liked certain parts of it, and I did what I could with it. But I've written crazier stuff and more offensive stuff in the past, and there's even less audience for that. So, what can you do?
I think it's a question of how much you're willing to enter the marketplace, because it seems like to be read anymore requires that you really become a champion on behalf of your work and sort of fight to bring it to people's attention.
Yeah, I can't really do that. I fully accept what you're saying is true because I know it firsthand. The only times that I've sold any copies of anything is when I've taken the marketing in hand and I've designed Facebook ads and so on. And the Constitution book has probably been the best seller, but even that's never sold more than 4 or 5 copies a month. But
Well,
yeah, you have to go
how
out
many
and
have you
rent.
moved so in total?
What's that?
How many of those have you moved in total?
Oh, I don't have any idea. Certainly not more than 50, maybe 40 at the most in a year, you know? And you might make, depending on where you set the price, might make anywhere between $5 and $7 per copy you sell. I mean, the list price is $18.99, but you'll make between 5 and 7. So some months I get lucky and I might make 50 or $60. But yeah. So the only times I've gotten sales is when I've gone ahead and marketed it. But the type of writing that I always thought I would be doing, like if I had the choice, it's not the kind of writing you can then put on a different hat and go out and decide to market. All the stuff that I used to write, these short pieces from a specifically different deranged point of view, it's not like I'm writing a book that I want to be interviewed about on NPR so I can claim that I am the author of the book, For
Sure.
me, it was always like an elaborate literary joke, and it was designed to be as horrible as possible and yet other things at the same time. And you could not write that kind of shit and then turn around and like take on the public role of the quote unquote author who is advocating for your own works. You can't do it because it's
Sure.
just not compatible.
Well, maybe if you had a third party. I was talking to some of my friends about how we want to put together a website and a coffee table book for some of the phenomena that we're discussing in this talk. And saying, we wanted to make a coffee table book called "Failures of God," and in it we would put, a large photo spread and then like some anecdotes about it. So the sort of story that would go in there would
I think your mic might be covered. Say it again.
I said, well, an example of one of the things that would go into that book would be, for instance, the large female orangutan, which was trained to be a prostitute in Southeast Asia, and how, the town, when aid workers from the UN tried to take the orangutan back, the town arrived in force with automatic weapons so they wouldn't be able to take the orangutan away because people loved fucking it too much. And even once they had to come back with AK-47s in a huge team to extricate it. And now, whenever a male scientist approaches it, it'll spread its legs and proceed to gyrate because it's been so trained.
Yeah.
So it would have stuff in it like that, and we call it Failures of God. And we're like, well, there could be an accompanying website called Voices of the Kali Yuga, and we could just aggregate all this stuff. So in an environment like that, your literary experiments would fit neatly, and as a third party, that site could, advocate for their being read.
Well, I think the idea of the book that you describe is an excellent one. If it's a coffee table book full of photos and, everything has like a 2-page spread or a 4-page spread, you could market that and sell it, and it would probably make pretty good money. And if you had a website where you're talking about things that are complete failures or things that degenerate excess and so on, sure. I mean, just about anything I've written you could mention, and it would be consistent with that. There isn't a whole lot of way to success, though, now with anything like that, because for as much as everyone thinks the internet has opened things up, it really hasn't. You have a much more fragmented market, it seems to me, but you've got such a number of people desperately trying to climb that greasy pole. Like you go to disinfo.com, you see it all the time. People are hawking their own books all the time. People become bloggers and they post their own articles to disinfo.com in order to generate a following, and then they'll come out with a yearly book, which they'll try to get the followers to buy. It's all economics from start to finish, this production. And that's not even to mention the total bankruptcy of fucking academic literature production, where, you write reviews of other literature professors' books so that they will write favorable reviews of your books, and no one buys the books but fucking university libraries and other literature professor. That total circle jerk. That's what avant-garde literature has become, a big academic circle jerk.
Yeah, it's a ceaseless clamoring. I remember, shortly before I left college and gave up on being a philosophy professor, one of my professors was advising me, well, if you want to become successful, the first thing you need to do is go to conferences and find people who are speaking and claim that you like their work when you don't actually like their work, and compliment them on it, and just do that constantly. And sooner or later, you'll get somewhere.
There's absolutely no question. I can tell you from firsthand experience. Philosophy was my passion. That was what trained my brain. And I had some limited exposure to it and got out. But there was a friend of mine when I first went to college who, many years later, recently, for some unknown reason, decided that he was going to not only get his degrees, but basically become a philosophy professor. And that's exactly what he did in Dublin. And it's the exact same fucking thing. I mean, I heard stories before I stopped talking to the guy. I heard stories about how he'd have to go to conferences and hobnob and do precisely that sort of thing in order to have any chance of getting positions. And when it came to the academic journal articles he had to write, he had to constantly pull his punches and not, accuse so and so or not point out the so and so is completely full of shit, because that would ruin his chances for employment. And he was doing all this political theory bullshit like John Rawls. I mean, make me gag. And all that. And he kept getting better and better at it. And I think in a way he was like trying to show me, that he was able to do the ho ho ho. And at one point he sent me this academic article that he wrote. Absolutely solid piece of work. Solid piece of writing. But from my point of view, totally fucking useless. Because all it is in academic philosophy, as you know, it's just a lot of little tactical repositionings. Hair splitting, tactical. Nobody's coming out with any wild new ideas. Fuck no. They're all just, it's hair splitting. It's a little dance. We all dance around. And, well, I have to differ on this point from so and so who does such excellent work. But then if I drop the input, blah, blah, blah. It's garbage. So what he
Yeah,
did,
it's
he
like a
wrote
tea
this
party.
enormous thing, and it was totally fucking useless.
It's like it's like watching a bitter fight at a tea party, where people, what they're really saying is, I hope you die. Everything you say is a blight on humanity. It would really be better if you stop talking and you never open your mouth again. But instead they say, Well, I think that you don't fully succeed at embodying the ideals that you aspire to. Uh, and for that reason, the form of discourse that you've chosen to advance your cause is insufficiently calibrated to your ambitions. And for that reason, perhaps it would be wise, for a time at least, to follow the dictum at the end of the Tractatus and uh, and abide by the fact that wherever one cannot speak, one must be silent. And I mean, and if you get used to it enough, you can hear something like that, and it'll reach you like just saying "fuck you." You know what I mean?
Well, there's a
But
lot of that. There's a lot of coded, there is some passionate hatred of one another, but a lot of it that they don't even have the sincerity to be passionate. I would, for a time before the guy sent me this final article, I had helped him with his fucking PhD thesis, which to me gave me a feeling of satisfaction because it made me feel like, oh, my hand is still in. And I must not have lost everything if I can help somebody else do a fucking PhD thesis. But I mean, the subject matter was bullshit and all this kind of stuff. But anyway, I mean, you get later on to like the stuff he was sending me, and it ends up being like a debate about whether some minor academic's interpretation of a minor political theorist has an aspect which is normative or not. And they've got like a massive debate about whether some minor aspect of a minor interpretation of a minor political theorist is normative. What? That's what all they spend their time doing.
well, I mean, whether something, just to play devil's advocate for a minute, whether or not something is normative could be politically charged in a way, because saying whether or not it's making pronouncements that apply to the general to people's ethical behavior or whatever could have some kind of implication. I
Well,
mean, you're not
I should be
wrong.
more clear. I mean, as a factual matter, if some specific interpretation of a theory, blah blah blah, any factual matter has settling any factual question has value. I agree. That's you know even however trivial, if you can establish something as being the truth of something, there's a value to that, however small. But this wasn't really what was at stake. What was at stake
Sure.
was is they would engage in this debate, and with each statement of a position, they would treat it as if this was highly valuable original philosophical work. In other words, it takes the place of philosophical work. So they have this like bullshit political theory which is founded on a lot of assumptions, and it's just a most derivative form of language game what they're doing, and they're doing that at the exclusion of what I would consider actual philosophy. I mean, Nietzsche wasn't sitting around doing that shit. He was busy being creative, original, coming up with a whole new way of
Nevertheless,
looking at things.
hasn't it always been the case that the majority of people working in the field are doing exactly what we're complaining about? And people like Kant or Hume or Nietzsche are, just breaking away and, basically recognizing that if a debate is interminable, then the next step is to identify the presupposition common to both sides and just start in a completely different direction. I mean, hasn't it always been that way in a way, or do you hold that this is worse?
Well, it has always been that way, but it's worse now, I think. And I could be wrong. But I mean, anytime you have an original thinker, you always have these schools that spring up around them that are all derivative, and they organize themselves according to insider outsider. It's based on mimicry. It's the same old thing. I mean, you had the Kantians, you had the young Hegelians, you had every continental thinkers produced these basically useless people who ride on the coattails. They have their own disputations and so on. So that's all true. Today, if there's any difference, I would maybe place the blame at the feet of the economics of it, because the economic dimension of everyday life today is so coercive that whereas before you had like a sliver of a chance of a truly original thinker breaking through. Now it seems like there's no chance at all.
Well, maybe it'll happen outside of the academic circles because, it's only relatively recently that philosophy has been, fully professionalized. Before Kant, all these the great people like Descartes and Spinoza and Leibniz were men of letters, but they weren't, professional teachers of philosophy per se, And it's only in that post-Kantian era that everyone who writes becomes a professor and therefore complicit in the academic establishment. It's a recent historical development, and it's something maybe that the tightness and the economic stricture might squeeze development outside. Especially since so many of the important questions are impossible to take up under the dominant ideologies of reductive materialism and so on, because the really important philosophical questions are I dare say, are the sort of things we talk about in the podcast. Does consciousness survive death? What is the nature of the alien visitation? Stuff like that. There are perfectly important philosophical things in terms of ethically and politically that don't have anything to do with that on the surface. But the metaphysical questions that have to do with how does reality arise, what is consciousness's place in it, really is something that might happen more, at least potentially, in the domain that also deals with these paradoxical and enigmatic apparitions.
Well, I don't disagree. We're still talking just about the situation today with, or the extent to which institutionalized philosophy, and not just philosophy but other things, are an obstacle. Then the term you use is probably dead on. The professionalization of philosophy. Nietzsche was not a philosophy professor, and owing to his illness, he exited the university scene fairly early in his professional career. So he wasn't really involved in university at all, and that was the case many times. I could be simply, trying to rationalize what ends up being a set of personal experiences. It's hard to say. Um, the impression I get today is that it's somehow less likely for the real thing to break through than before. And that could be supported by fact or not. It could be for other reasons. The sheer number of people all posing and pretending. But separate issue. Now, I don't doubt that genuine inquiry can take place and that there's a lot of material to work with. And in the different audio that we've done some pretty decent investigation of a lot of these different things. So, in principle, it's possible because there's still questions to be considered and ideas to be conceived and so on. I guess maybe looking for that precise combination where you're able to address the questions and come up with the real thing and do so in a given social environment, political environment, and all that sort of thing. I don't know. There's always been an incompatibility there, and comparing two different historical moments is not something you can really do quantitatively, so it's subjective. It's hard to say.
I feel like the truth of the matter is that institutions have a half-life for how long they can serve the interest of truth, and the longer they exist, the more they become complicit in the hegemonic interests of the forces that dominate society. And so, in the immediate wake of, someone like Jesus or Muhammad or Kant or Wittgenstein, you have a flurry of actual thinking about what was said. And then as it becomes, it's a truism, of course, that as it becomes further institutionalized, it dies. But I think with a sufficient degree of historical awareness, you could say that, it's time for the next wave of new institutions, which will, of course, or more than likely become complicit in the very system they're opposing. But, like, I feel like if people who are sufficiently interested in real philosophical questions could use the self-publishing tools and the peer-to-peer tools that exist to create, for instance, a new journal that is as serious and as well sourced and as well researched as what comes out of academia, but which isn't confined by its ideological strictures, then thought could happen there. Um, Similarly, I mean, I go around in these meditation communities and I find for the most part people aren't interested in real practice. People don't really acknowledge the possibility that enlightenment can be done. And I mean, I'll tell you, I mean, the first phase of enlightenment stream entry is something that's only about as hard as beating Mortal Kombat on very hard. It certainly takes time. It takes, hundreds or thousands of hours, but anyone can do it. But it's not a fact that anyone acknowledges. And also, all these communities are just like where people go and practice and learn things. They're just like these sort of dead shells, like academia. And so, in parallel to the idea, like, well, maybe independent people could create a new journal. I talk to my friends who are like, well, maybe there needs to be a new kind of Dharma center, where people actually just acknowledge the fact, like, yeah, you can get enlightened. It's not too different from learning to play the tuba. It also doesn't mean you're necessarily a holy entity or something. It means you're not suffering the way you were, and your sense of what's real is sort of displaced in a different direction. But I feel like if people could put their heads together, progress could happen spiritually, philosophically, um, just outside the margins of what's usually acknowledged and condoned.
Well, it could well be. It could well be. You have to have a sufficient number of people, and you have to have the opportunity, and you have to create something that has its own momentum and viability, and maybe be fortunate and have it succeed. But the trick is getting the right combination of factors all lined up to begin with in order for something like that to take off.
It's certainly true, but if, for example, the sort of people that we associated with just started making papers and just started, putting them together as a journal, it could be a beacon in the dark to whomever else is capable of doing academic work, but who doesn't, who can't do it within the existing structure. And before you know it, you have a fully functioning journal that's addressing these questions that nobody will address, and then it creeps back into the margins of what few academics would read, stuff like that, and it winds up getting citations and having a sort of trickle down effect into the dominator ideologies, and you know but the whole trouble with any kind of change when it comes to things like academia or religion or politics is it's mostly like erosion. Erosion is very powerful. I mean, it wears away mountains and it changes landscapes, but you can never really see it. The change certainly takes place, but and, it could all be reversed in a sudden cataclysm, or it could ultimately equilibrate, or it's uh, it's uh, it's a very and yet the trouble is that if all these sorts of issues that are threatening the human species are real, and I believe they are. You've got environmental instability, you've got the encroaching reality of the police state, you've got these unknown forces at the fringes of generally acknowledged reality. And so you have all these pressing threats. And so this erosion level glacial change it takes to change minds and move thought could be radically insufficient.
Yeah, I don't doubt that it is.
Sure.
And for each individual, the idea of going outside of yourself and trying to affect some sort of change in your environment, is the decision to attempt such a change is always individual, I think. Uh, you have a lot of subjective forces, some known, some unknown, um, views of the world, some known, some unknown, that all sort of figure in. And when it comes to the current historical moment, if that's what you're talking about, I fully agree. I don't think that personally, from my perspective, there's a lot of decisive social change that can be achieved. Everything is against it. And the forces against it have been innovating for decades, whereas the forces that might engage in trying to change things in a significant way, they don't have any practice at it. They're not organized. They've never done it. They don't have any momentum. It's like, if you've got a pot with some water in it, right? And the gas is on and the water starts to achieve a slow boil. Well, if somebody's able to simply turn off the gas every single time it comes close to a slow boil, it never reaches a complete boiling point. And that's all there is to it. I mean, the forces that are opposed to these kinds of decisive changes, basically, they've got decisive levels of power. So, like popular uprising and so on, I don't see any future in it. Maybe if there's a window of opportunity when this or that power structure breaks down and cannibalizes itself and is distracted, then something might come through. But
You never know, though. I mean, it is true that there is those people who want to see things get better need to really step up their game. It's like Martin Luther King said, those who love peace must learn to organize as effectively as those who love war. And I think that the challenging reality of the situation is well articulated in the key. It says that, the desire to lead is a symptom. And the implication being that the people who are in power, the people who rush to fill vacuums in power, are precisely those people whose interests are not in keeping with the actualization of human potentiality, with the realization of wisdom and compassion in the social and cultural world. So, as a matter of course, the worst are in positions of power because those are the people who crave it most desperately and who seek it with the greatest fervor. And yet, maybe the pending ecological and social and political and economic catastrophes could be enough of a catalyst to cause people to self organize in new ways. I think that if you're not in the middle of it, it's easy to underestimate how much volatility there really is because it doesn't get widely reported in mainstream media, and even watching things flash up on social media doesn't even give a very clear picture because in the past couple years, the things I've been a part of, there are thousands of angry people, tens of thousands who mass at any given thing. Whether they were marching about Mike Brown or Eric Garner, or whether it was back during Occupy, or this, that thing, you show up at these things, and I'm constantly shocked by the fact that, oh, there are 10,000 people here, and they all understand what it feels like. Most of the time, practically nobody understands. They know that the government is controlled by corporations and the interests of, concentrated sectors of private capital are destroying the world, both environmentally and socially. They know that, that everything is controlled by these elites that have only their own interests at heart and, really need to keep everyone else in a position of ignorance and economic instability so that they'll work for less and won't make any kind of demand. People understand what's wrong, and and when you're in the middle of it and you see, oh, there's 10,000 people here and they know this, the question then becomes, wow, People get it, but they don't have something around which to rally. They don't know where to put their energy because, and if they did know where to put their energy, if there were an effective route of organization in place for them, these elites may very well be in trouble because, by definition, there are fewer of them than there are of us. The funny thing is that cataclysmic, uproarious change could happen, but would it? Because it's like the scientists say that maybe we might not be able to adapt to ecological problems because any system only expends as little energy as it can to escape danger. If a bird sees a cat, it'll jump up to the next branch. It won't necessarily jump to the top of the tree. What we really need to do is jump to the top of the tree, but humans are going to keep, or for economic reasons, are going to keep making incremental changes, and the incremental changes will never be enough to keep up with the destabilization of the system. You know what I mean? So everything that's needed to make the change exists, but then where is the lightning rod? Where is the point of self-organization that could allow it to just pass that critical threshold?
I don't doubt that things do occur that are historically new. And if you wanted to view it in such terms, you could say that human history is subject to something like a punctuated equilibrium pattern, much like some believe biological evolution is. But, and I also wouldn't discourage people from being up in arms and protesting and doing anything or everything they can. But it's not a contradiction necessarily to say that, from my point of view, in trying to understand the situation such as it is, whatever meaning that has, I tend to see things in terms of existing forces and tendencies and so on. And, how you get from a group of 10,000 or 100,000 angry people who at least are like-minded in this or that respect on a particular issue, how you get from that to decisive social political change, it's not at all immediately obvious, because the fact is that a given protest is allowed to happen precisely because it does not threaten to cause any political change. If it did, it wouldn't be allowed to occur. And you see this, when the power structure begins to intervene is when there's an actual reason to. When there's no reason, it doesn't. And my assessment is that all of the cards, they're holding all the cards. So it seems to me the likeliest scenario is that their own excess will doom them and us. They'll doom all of us. And the only moment that you'll see something like a positive counter-reaction to the flow of history is when basically things have fallen apart to such an extent that there's an opportunity for that. But that's just a snapshot at a given moment. It's entirely possible that something radical could happen, or simply decisive, or things could change in unpredictable ways. And all of a sudden, events could flow in a very different direction to the way that they seem to be flowing now.
The really funny thing and the lamentable thing, something which is at once hopeful and lamentable, is the fact that all that's needed in order to catalyze social uprising and revolution exists. If people understood what was going on economically and politically and environmentally, they would act. But their perception of reality is so efficiently conditioned in the interest of the existing system that even when they see this information, they can't successfully assimilate it because it doesn't fit in with the frameworks that they already accept as defining what is or what could be. And so they screen it out because perception is largely a selective process, or because of habitual forms of social or cultural organization. They don't expose themselves to outlets of information where they would find out about these things, or they've been conditioned that the language in which some of this potentially radicalizing information has been contextualized as the language of the enemy, because if they hear, for example, the word social justice, that means socialism, which is the opposite of what they grew up with, or if they hear climate change, that means something the opposite of their religion, or what have you. There. So it's so lamentable, and yet somehow almost hopeful that the information that's needed to radicalize people is right there. I mean, it's factually the case that we're on the edge of a cliff, and it's just a matter of whether or not a sufficient number of people could somehow become aware of it. Do you see what I mean? It's almost there, and yet can anything provide enough momentum to push the system over the edge of this hill so it rolls down the other side? And it's an unknown as of yet.
Yeah, I know what you mean, and I would say you could describe it as the classic case of, the people out in the snowstorm who freeze to death just feet away from their tent, but who are unable to see or find the tent because they're in the midst of the snowstorm. That happens all the time, and there's nothing to prevent it from happening. There isn't necessarily, well, let's just put it this way, it's an open question, at least in my mind, whether there's any kind of moral meaning to the universe, such that, like in the movies, human beings at the last minute will wise up, at least enough of them, so that, there's a happy ending. But for just the way you describe, people are wrong about so many things. Practically everything you hear is a lie or a calculated falsehood today in the news. And when you look at history, it goes well beyond conspiracy theory. I mean, at this point, don't necessarily believe that any historical representation is basically accurate. It's not because, I see the Illuminati behind every corner, but just because too many times it's been shown to be false on every level. Recent events, distant past events. So history is basically wrong most of the time. The history that people believe. And you have all these other factors. I mean, the social dynamics of belief. The fact that these idiots are giving any time worrying about the Confederate flag, or the fact that they have been so easily led by the nose to see the militarization of police as basically the same old story of cops beating up blacks. The people miss the new reality because of the time-tested, worn narratives of the media that they like to trot out because it's the story they're familiar with. You've got the people who believe the talking points, whether it's MSNBC talking points or Fox News talking points. People who actually believe any of the shit is at all true. And they make up most of the population. So why all of a sudden these morons would begin to see the sunlight through the clouds? I don't see anything to suggest that they would. There's no social pressure or social force for them to do so. And there's nothing that says either that when your life is at stake that you would, because throughout history, people have been led to complete catastrophe and annihilation, believing absurdities and falsehoods and things that aren't accurate at all. So,
It's like Althusser says. No, I'm sorry. It's not what I'm thinking of. Adorno says that to erect truth directly amid the general falsehood is to pervert the former to the later. If you try to tell people the straightforward reality of what's going on, they can't understand it. Because it's assimilated within a cultural construct where it can't even make sense. Or take Chomsky. He was asked, in that documentary about manufacturing consent. Why aren't you ever on 60 Minutes? The New York Times refers to you as the greatest intellectual of our time. How do you not wind up on 60 Minutes? And he says, concision is the enemy of truth. Because, if someone were to get on and say the biggest terrorist operations in the world are run out of Washington, D.C., it would just seem like nonsense. And what I'm getting at is, one has almost the urge to run screaming through the streets with the bullhorn because it seems completely obvious, what's wrong. And yet, doing so would be the very image of futility because you are speaking in an entirely different language. And it's a gap between one who is aware and one who is not that it is very difficult to see how to bridge.
Oh, sure. I don't see any way to bridge it at all other than a total abandonment of your participation in all of the cultural life of the people that you're sandwiched among. I mean, I these days experience it's beyond alienation. I mean, I think alienation is kind of rejection of things, but I have like a non-relation anymore to history, to politics, to science, to almost everything in cultural life. It's like it's something going on elsewhere. It's other people. They're doing it. And in this respect, I finally at last joined maybe the lumpen proletariat. Like the mouth breathers who all of human civilization is just something that other people are doing. That's as far as they get in their perception of it. Well, I've gone full circle to that now because I don't have any participation in any of it. Maybe when I was a kid, I would have cared about who's elected president. Now I can see that it's totally irrelevant. Maybe when I was a kid, I'd have faith in the Enlightenment project of science and associate the two. Well, I don't anymore. I see all of the institutional defects of science, the way that it's its own obstacle to its own ideals in every aspect, history, politics. I mean, if you believe, for example, that the official story of 9/11 is bullshit, you're lost. History's lost to you. There's no more relationship. And then when you go and look back at all these events, great and small, and you look at the degree to which people operate according to pure myth today, world history is not something. I don't know what history is. I don't really know what's happened to anything. I'm becoming a person who can't even think because I realize that I can't really believe anything is factual because too many times it's been shown to be false. So eventually, like you just simply disengage. You're like that, air bubble in the water that forms and tries to eject itself out of the water. It's the opposite of activism. Let's put it that way.
Well, I can certainly see the potential to fall into that sort of quietism and non-participation. But the thing that keeps me going is, the reality that, there are a lot of people who get it. And if they could be sufficiently organized, their numbers are sufficiently great and their positions in society are sufficiently diverse that that change can begin. It's simply that the existing system has been very effective at separating people from effective means of doing anything with these convictions. And I think that outside of that theoretical circle of people who get it, there is a minority of people. It may be a significant minority that can be swayed on certain issues. Who can't. I mean, for example, outside the United States, global warming isn't a question. Most people I talk to, if you really persist in the discussion, they can concede that it's the case. I think that beyond the people who are really passionately engaged and informed, there are these people I'm talking about right now, who can be swayed in some way even if only out of their rational self-interest, if not out of service to the greater good, however, whatever that means. And that between the people who already really get it and really care, and the people who can be swayed, at least to a limited extent, on certain things, even if only for their rational self-interest, there is enough of a ground for change to swing the seesaw in the opposite direction. The question is, where is the lightning rod? The question is, where is the principle of self-organization that can catalyze that? Because the potential exists. And, in all of their calculations to increase their dominance and control, the powers that be fear that eventuality and they act against it. They lay increasing plans to move away from it. And if they, in their knowledge and their foresight from their intelligence apparatus and their analysts and so on, if they see the possibility, then that's in a way an acknowledgement, because elsewise you would need to ramp up the police state. I mean, because the infrastructure for sharing information is unlike anything we've had before. Yes, of course, people mostly use it to look at videos of cats and to talk about the Kardashians. But the infrastructure exists, the convictions exist. It's a matter of finding a way to put them together. And it may very well be that we as the human species will freeze outside the tent, only 1 foot away from our salvation. But it cannot be overemphasized, at least in my own mind, that we're teetering on a precipice where we could roll down one side of the hill or the other. One side leads to oblivion, the other side leads to at least some limited form of salvation. So perhaps, and just perhaps, one of us can, enough of us can fumble into the tent, or enough of us can put our backs against the boulder and roll it in the other direction. The potential exists, and unprecedented things, as you yourself acknowledge, do happen. So we'll have to
Well, you
see.
could well be right. Yeah, I wouldn't try to dissuade you at all. And obviously, the happier outcome is to be preferred. There's no dispute about that.